Hey, y'all, it's Brandon Adams, the host of DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. We have today what I think is going to be a really great show. There was some really good news on Tuesday that I probably did not pay enough attention to or speak to you enough about, but we'll do that a little bit later on. It involves recruiting and our buddy Jeff Sintel, so I'll let you hear that in just a couple of minutes, what I think is potentially a pretty good development here for the 2019 class. We'll also talk a little bit more about Georgia, Florida on today's show. There will be a little bit on the quarterbacks, but honestly not a ton. But also a really important point to make off the top of the program about how, once again, I believe that the national media just simply doesn't understand a fundamental issue about this Georgia team this year. Frankly, it's kind of my role to correct the myths on that, so I'll take that task seriously here as DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, begins right now.
From DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
When a big national power like Georgia loses, there is always going to be a little bit of, see, I told you so after the fact. A lot of national media people are going to step up and get their pound of flesh on UGA because that's the kind of thing that gets a lot of attention here. And, you know, that's to be expected. And the see, I told you so's don't necessarily have to come from people who actually did some telling before the fact. It just becomes kind of a convenient thing to throw what looks like dirt on the grave after that. I'm going to start today's show with some of that. And honestly, I'm not doing this to wallow in the misery here. For the most part, we turned the page on the program yesterday in terms of feeling a little bit better about the Florida game in 2 weeks, looking ahead to solutions about how Georgia can play better. I thought we did a pretty good job of doing that yesterday. So go into the negative here from the one national writer I'm about to read to you is not about, like I said, wallowing in the misery so much as it is responding to the point that the writer makes, which is honestly not all wrong, not all insignificant. Some of it's probably worth paying some credence to. But by doing so, I think it actually sets us up for something pretty interesting this morning here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. So let me, with that said, turn my attention to Dan Wolken from USA Today, who, in writing about Georgia on the heels of its loss to LSU, says this: can we finally dispense with the ridiculous notion that Georgia is, quote, more talented than last year? People have been saying that. Wolken goes on to say the biggest problem with a fan base like Georgia's, which used to live in terror that the other shoe is about to drop, buying into the idea that it's the second coming of Alabama, is that Alabama doesn't represent reality for Georgia or anyone. Alabama never loses games like that. He means the one that Georgia just played LSU. Wolken then says, Georgia's always going to have really good players, but the combination of talent and experience that got the Bulldogs to the brink of a national title last season was not something you can replicate every year. And for a fan base that was undeservedly starting to get that invincible feeling, this was a crash back to a world of personnel problems exposed and coaching gripes and power. Now, listen, the last part of that is indisputable, right? I mean, there have been plenty of coaching gripes here over the last few days, and some personnel problems exposed, maybe some of that as well. I will also grant Wolken this, that as someone who lives most of my life directly within the bubble of DawgNation, maybe there was a little bit of unjustified feelings of invincibility. And maybe there was a little bit of an unjustified comparison to Alabama. Maybe even I, unfortunately, was guilty of some of that. Now, Georgia did play Alabama tooth and nail a year ago, but Alabama's been in the spot that it's in now for years and years and years. Georgia's sort of spot in that perch has only been about a year's worth here. So maybe there was some undue feelings of superiority around Georgia fans. I won't deny some of that, and the rest of the season is going to determine if that was completely, erroneous, if that was completely out of left field, or if those feelings that Georgia fans had at the beginning of the season were justified. Now, I assume that Georgia's going to play better here the rest of the way, but if it doesn't, guys like Dan Wolken who want to say that Georgia fans were delusional, or whatever word you want to use there, to an honest point, some of that will be maybe justified if that ends up being more of the same like we saw this past Saturday against LSU. But there is, however, another point that Wolken makes in this that I think it's really important to rebut here. Wolken says it's ridiculous that some Georgia fans thought that this Georgia team is more talented than last year's Georgia team. Now, this to a certain extent, it makes my head hurt to kind of go back down this road again, because we have discussed this over and over and over again, the difference between talent and experience. That, yes, experience is really important to have, and yet if you have an experienced middling level of talent compared to an elite level of talent that doesn't have experience, I'll take the talent over the experience any day of the week, which is not to discount what Georgia had last year with Chubb and Michelle and Lorenzo Carter and Roquan Smith. Obviously, those are all-time great Georgia players. They'll be revered for 50 years from now in terms of what they did for Georgia in 2017. But the overall notion that this Georgia team is more talented than last year's Georgia team, frankly, is just quantifiably true. You can measure it based on recruiting rankings. You can measure it based on potential NFL futures. You see more of that kind of stuff on this Georgia team than you saw in last Georgia team, even if some of the guys that were the most talented were also the most experienced and had big seasons for Georgia in 2017. So it's simply false to say that this Georgia team is less talented than last year's team. However, it also may end up being true that this Georgia team, despite that talent, may not be quite as good as the one in 2017. That's fair to point out. But to keep with this same line of conversation here for a moment, let me give you a couple of examples of how I think it sort of bears out that, yes, this team is more talented, even if the results right now are in doubt the rest of the season. Look at Georgia's offensive line for a moment. Now, most people would say the offensive line has not had a great season. That's probably true. But it played without Andrew Thomas for a little while at the beginning of the season, and it's playing without Ben Cleveland, a former five-star recruit, for a long stretch right now. Imagine if Georgia's offensive line a year ago had suffered those level of injuries. Would Georgia have been able to replace those guys as effectively as it's done so this year? No, it would not. It did not have a Cade Mays-level player as a backup a year ago. It just didn't. This year, the fact that Georgia does have that is an example of some talent that Georgia has now that otherwise would not have had. I think that's an important point to bring up. However, as Kirby Smart, if he was sitting here right now, would say, listen, BA, you can't get too worked up about what Dan Wolken's saying here. These kinds of issues showing up, bubbling up after a loss like LSU, it's just to be expected. I mean, there are lots of questions being asked right now about whether or not Georgia was exposed against LSU on Saturday. And Kirby Smart, when he spoke to the media on Tuesday night, had a pretty pragmatic response to all of that. Here's what Kirby had to say.
Well, I think a lot of times it exposes some of your weaknesses. I think wins can do that. I personally think that the games we've won that so many people have, talked about, I've seen some of the same mistakes, and we've highlighted them to our team. And sometimes it takes that loss to make them really understand. And I certainly think our guys recognize that we have to get better, and we're going to. The only way to get better, guys, is to work. And that's what we're doing now. It's time to grow, and there's no magic pill. You don't take a magic pill and say, we're just going to get better. No, we got to go to work. And we got to go to work as coaches. We got to go to work as players, and we're going to continue to do that.
I think that's an important point for Kirby Smart, saying that I'm going to use this LSU game to try to get the players' attention even further than I've got before, and there's no magic pill here. We've just got to get back to work. Which kind of brings us back to what Dan Wolken said about Georgia's talent level. Being deficient compared to the team in 2017, factually, I think he's wrong. But what's going to end up making him look right if Georgia doesn't get better in one key area here that right now would seem to be specifically about talent. And that's the issue that Georgia's had with stopping the run, not just against LSU, but against Missouri to a certain extent, against Vanderbilt to a certain extent. Right now, it just doesn't look like Georgia's got the bodies, both the size, the athleticism, the overall talent, to get that done. Now, we've talked a lot this week about how maybe that could change by the end of the season if some of the young players can step up. But you can't deny right now that if Wolken wants to point out the talent issue for Georgia's defense, especially when it comes to stopping the run, there's some of that kind of sticks here a little bit. That's a criticism for Georgia that seems to have some validity at the moment. And in fact, Kirby Smart, on the subject of where he thinks the team needs to get better this week, really drilled down on that very intensely on the subject of why there were so many missed tackles against LSU. Here's a little bit from Kirby on that.
Tackling, poor gap fits, maybe conditioning played a little bit into it. But at the end of the day, we got to try to put the players in a better position, and we got to tackle good. You got to be physical in this league. Those backs are what we're going to face every week. 215, 220 pounds, downhill. You got to hit, wrap up, and we got to get more people to the ball so that it's not a one-on-one tackles. You don't win a lot of one-on-one tackles in this league. You win a lot of two-on-one tackles. We got to have more two-on-one tackles.
I think what Kirby says there about the notion of two-on-one tackles, double teaming a ball carrier to bring him down as opposed to the one-on-one tackling, I think that's really interesting in light of who Georgia's about to play to Saturday snap from now, Florida. Dan Mullen, one of these classic spread-style coaches, and Bill Conley, some of the people at Football Study Hall have written about this, that one of the things that the spread coaches like to do is increase the number of solo tackles you have to make on them. That's the whole point of spread. Spread you out wide, so it's one-on-one battles, and you're having to make tackles there in space. So Kirby Smart says he wants less of that, but Dan Mullen, 2 Saturdays from now, is going to try to create an offensive game plan where Georgia's doing more of that, the one-on-one tackling stuff, which is going to put even more pressure on the talent level that Georgia does have in its front seven. Also, when you talk about guys like Michael Pirine and Jordan Scarlett, those Florida running backs here, much like what you saw from LSU with Brosette and Edwards-Helaire last week, Kirby Smart says, hey, tackling these kind of running backs, that's what SEC football is all about.
Probably the quality of back you play, it pops up more, and the exposure to those tackles, sometimes they don't get through there. And so it doesn't expose your corners, your secondary, when it doesn't get past your linebackers. But the more it gets back there, the more you get exposed. And we had a couple, especially in short yardage situations, where we took chances to try to stop them. Ball spit, and it was a one-on-one tackle with Richard or a one-on-one tackle with JR. And we didn't win the one-on-one battle. And when you do that, they're going to convert, and the conversions turn to 17, 18 yards.
All right, let me do a quick bottom line on all of this because I think Kirby Smart's making a lot of sense there. When Dan Wilkins says that this Georgia team is less talented than last year's Georgia team, I think he's wrong. However, if Georgia doesn't get better before the end of the season at stopping the run and limiting those opportunities for rushing yards for its opponents, Wilkins and the other guys who say that about Georgia's talent level are certainly going to appear to be right. That's why it's so crucial, as we talked about with Mike Griffith a little bit yesterday, as we've talked to Jeff Sintel now about a couple of times, for some of those young players on defense who seem to be close, Jordan Davis, Channing Tindall, Brenton Cox, who's on the field yet not generating a lot of sacks, for those guys to keep stepping towards bigger roles, bigger opportunities, bigger playing time. A lot of the talent on this Georgia roster right now admittedly is young, but as that young talent grows up, Georgia's defense has a chance of improving before the season's done as well. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. Good to have you with us live on video, 10 a.m. DawgNation. Facebook, YouTube, Twitter feed. Fun to be with you on video every day. You also enjoy being on the radio, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, every day at noon there in the Classic City. That's always a blast. And in podcast form, whether it's the Apple Podcast Player, the Google stuff there for the Android devices, the world-famous DawgNation.com. Some of you listen straight through SoundCloud, however you get to us. Thanks for being a part of our program here today. Also, huge thanks to Marco's Pizza for making it all possible. And as a way of saying thanks to them, why don't you say hello primo by taking advantage of a great offer. 2 medium, 2 topping pizzas, everyday value of $6.99 each. It's authentic Italian quality pizza. It tastes good, and it's good on your wallet as well. In fact, so much so that I saw our buddy Dave Holcomb, who works with us here at DawgNation World Headquarters, enjoying a little Marco's Pizza last night. Don't think I didn't notice that. He put a little bit of that out there on social media. That was a nice thing to see. And if you're like Dave and you take advantage of that great offer, you're going to be really happy too. Gianmarco family recipe in the sauce, 3 cheeses blended together. I think it's one of the real crucial deals there with the Marco's Pizza. You got to have all that cheese blended together. I even get extra cheese on top of that sometimes. So it's good times. Check out Marco's Pizza at marcos.com. You will be glad you did that. A little bit different guest for us today. You guys have been asking to have him back on the program again, so we made some time today to welcome in Barrett Sallee from CBS Sports. Really interesting guy when it comes to covering the SEC. Barrett's got some big things to say. We'll talk to Barrett Sallee here coming up in just a couple of minutes. Before we get to that, though, I mentioned to our video audience before the show began that I've actually got some good news that I probably overlooked a little bit. I need to give some more attention to this. Jeff said this on Tuesday. The fact of the matter is we had so much going on Tuesday, I couldn't quite give this the full attention that it deserved. But Nakobe Dean, the 5-star linebacker from Horn Lake, Mississippi, near Memphis, who was supposed to take an official visit for the Vanderbilt game, the Georgia coaches asked him not to do that because they didn't really feel like they were going to be able to roll out the red carpet for him that day the way that they wanted to. Well, Dean agreed not to come for the Vanderbilt game, but has now rescheduled an official visit for the Auburn game coming up on November 10th. I think that's good news. I think it's a better situation for Georgia than the Vanderbilt official visit would have been, if not the best overall scenario there. On Before the Hedges yesterday, presented by Kroger, here's how Jeff described the nature of Dean's upcoming official visit, what it means for the good and maybe not so good for Georgia with Nakobe Dean. Here's Jeff on that.
I think there's one thing that nobody has thought or felt or said on a message board yet about the LSU game, and that was maybe how Georgia was pretty wise not to want to host Nakobe Dean for his official visit, to take away from some prep for the LSU game. Because obviously the Bulldogs needed to be all hands on deck in the film room for that. And I don't know how you should feel about this. Number one, you're going to have him in town for a big ball game where Athens will likely be popping no
would
matter
think so.
what the Tigers' record looks like at that time, and no matter whether Gus Malzahn, his seat can get any hotter there on the plane. But it does show one thing. It shows, number one, how tight his schedule is, because he's going to take an official visit after that to Auburn the following weekend. And then look for that LSU official now to come at the end of his season, after he's been in his All-Star game, and then after he's also finished his state championship run at Horn Lakes, Mississippi. So a lot of stuff to think about there. Georgia gets him on campus for an official visit, and now that seems very likely, when in the past it was very much in doubt.
So I'd rather have him in December, but the fact that Dean is coming in November for a big home game, nice atmosphere, I think that's pretty good for Georgia. And one of the things that I think makes Dean an attractive prospect for Georgia's 2019 class, despite the fact that Georgia's got some good freshman linebackers right now, other good linebacker commits for the class of 2019, when Nakobe Dean recently spoke to Jeff Sintel, he explained that, you know what, all that talent that's already there, not a turnoff for me. If anything, I like to be a part of the program where the very best linebackers want to play. Here's more from Nakobe Dean on that, another reason for UGA fans to like him.
What do you think would be the biggest reason if it ended up being Georgia?
My competitive nature. I know they deep at linebacker. You know, depth is good, so I do want myself to be talented. So I know if I can beat out everybody else, I can probably be the best.
Would you worry if you went to a place and you're on the first team in like 2 or 3 weeks? Would you worry about that type of school, that maybe they don't have enough guys like you to push you?
I would. I mean, I know how hard I work, how hard I would probably push everybody else to work to step the game up if I did ever feel like that.
So listen, it's talent like that with that kind of competitive fire that you want taking official visits to your program. I think it's good news that Dean's going to be at Georgia November 10th. As I said, December after the season's done, probably even better. But this is pretty good for UGA, and we'll see if the Dogs can win this recruiting battle over some of the South's top powers. It is DawgNation Daily here, presented by Marco's Pizza. As much as you love the action on the football field, don't forget there's also great action happening away from the field as well. Let me take a moment to tell you about that right now, because you know there's nothing like cheering on the Dogs every single Saturday in a sea of red and black, whether you were in Baton Rouge this past weekend or Athens on a regular Saturday. But you don't always have to be at the game to experience that energy. You can also connect with a local alumni chapter for a game-watching party with passionate volunteers. Alumni chapters keep you connected to your fellow Bulldogs through meaningful events and charitable actions. And it's not just game-watching parties, but it's also the Dog Days of Service. There are also a variety of professional and philanthropic activities that you can attend with other alumni of the University of Georgia right there in your city. Because with over 318,000 active alumni in 80 different chapters, the Bulldog Nation stretches to all corners of the world. UGA's commitment to you doesn't end when you leave Athens. That's a good thing. And no matter where you call home, you'll never have to bark alone. I like that line there. Make sure you connect with your local alumni chapter today by visiting this website, alumni.uga.edu/chapters. One more time, alumni.uga.edu/chapters. Great to have you in the program. Hope you enjoy Barrett Sallee right now. All right, we'll actually get Barrett Sallee coming up here in just a moment. Sorry for the bait and switch there on that, but we'll have Barrett here in just a second on that. But good to have you here today. Before we get Barrett's got to be pushed back here for a couple of minutes. The great news is we will have some time for a few comments. So we'll go ahead and bring the music down just for a second and get Barrett here. And we'll go ahead and bring the music down. We'll get Barrett here coming up. About 10 minutes, we'll have Barrett Sallee on the phone, which is good news here because that gives us some more time to get into some comments here and some things like that, your reaction to kind of whatever you want to get into here for a few minutes. We'll still do comments at the end of the show. We got a little bit of time for some comments right now as well, so we'll do that here coming up in just a second. We appreciate you being here on the program today. Let's find out what some folks are having to say. I'll get some YouTube comments coming up here as well. Let me pull up the Facebook here for a moment. Matt Rukavina says Nakobe Dean. Let me get Matt's comment. Boy, these Facebook comments got to really pop in here so fast. I can't even find that one anymore. Larry Payne says the only thing Auburn has going for recruits is immediate playing time. That's huge for 5-star recruits. So what Larry is referencing there is the fact that Dean, I guess according to Jeff, will take an official visit to Auburn for the Liberty game, which will be the week after Georgia takes on Auburn there in November. And, yes, early playing time is something to be sold. But right now, and we'll talk to Barrett Sallee when he joins us about this in just a moment. Right now, there is there is so much turmoil going on in Auburn, despite the fact that Malzahn just signed the $49 million extension this past offseason. I mean, based on what you hear coming out of Auburn, this may all be conjecture right now. Auburn may even play a little bit better before the season's done. I'll give you my thoughts on their game with Ole Miss here coming up in a couple of minutes. But as it stands right now, I think if you're Nakobe Dean or any future prospect of that Auburn class, I think you have to be really concerned about what the program's going to look like next year. Now, it's one thing if Gus Malzahn stays, but almost it's seemingly impossible that he'd be able to stay right now with the full coaching staff that he has right now still intact. And that's where things get really tricky for a lot of these recruits who do develop relationships with the guys on staff, and they want that feeling of continuity with them when they get ready to do something like that. So I think that's a huge, huge question right now. I actually don't view Auburn as one of the chief competitors for Nakobe Dean, even though we've heard that program mentioned a couple of times. For me, it kind of gets back to those more traditional powers like Alabama and LSU. At one point in time, there's a lot being said about Florida State. At this point in time, I wonder if Florida State also in a kind of a similar situation, just a little bit too of a rocky road right now. Shantrio West checking in from Albany, Georgia, saying, play Otis Reese and Trey Bishop some more. Certainly in the case of Reese, that's one of those other freshmen that may have a chance to play and contribute more by the end of the season. And obviously Reese brings that extra dimension to Georgia, kind of a safety-style runner that also hits like a linebacker. At some point in time, that's a guy you want to have, be a part of your program and doing big things for you here. And that's also a name that on Tuesday, Jeff Sentell suggested could have that role by the end of the season. I sort of get the impression that a guy like Tyndall may be in line for something like that earlier. Georgia probably needs Tyndall right now more than it needs Reese. I think the Georgia secondary, for the most part, has kind of played okay. I think it's been one of the stronger position groups of the entire team thus far, star position included. But the Georgia linebacking core is one of those areas in which you do need to see improved performance, and I think a guy like Tyndall getting more playing time could eventually give you that list. A lot of you referencing Tyson Campbell here. Listen, I have zero doubt that Tyson Campbell remains the best option for Georgia, the other cornerback position. I think he's going to be, one day maybe even as good as DeAndre Baker is now. I'm going to take the good and the bad with Campbell because overall there's going to be a lot more good than bad. Willie Gray Jr. says, BA, do you think we're using Demetrius Robertson correctly? Well, right now it seems like Georgia's not really using him at all, so I guess from that standpoint it seems one way or another it's incorrect. I was watching the SEC Network last night, and they were showing, and I know we all get tired of Alabama at a certain point, but they were showing some of the work that the Alabama wide receivers were doing, and I want to say it was a Jerry Jeudy, kind of like a smoke route thing where it's, you just turn and throw to the sideline. And I believe it was Devontae Smith who absolutely just walloped a defensive back to give Jeudy the running lane to run on. This is in the Missouri game. It almost looked like the classic example of what Kirby Smart kind of calls millennial Oklahoma. The old school Oklahoma drill was a blocker, a would-be tackler, and a running back just, smashing together in 3 yards in a cloud of dust fashion. Kirby says millennial Oklahoma is when you throw to that wide receiver and he tries to get a block out there against a defensive back. This was in a game what that millennial Oklahoma drill kind of looks like. And Devontae Smith, who's got NFL aspirations the same as Demetrius Robertson would, just absolutely walloped. Just absolutely laid lumber on a defensive back for Missouri. And Jerry Jeudy had an easy run there. I believe I've got the receivers right. It was Jeudy running, Smith doing the blocking, and it did bring to mind Demetrius Robertson that some people sort of flippantly disregard the notion of receivers need to block. They say that that's not what Demetrius Robertson came to Georgia to do. But if you want to be a full-fledged receiver in every capacity, blocking is, I think, something that you do have to do there. And so if Robertson is indeed, as some have assumed, not embracing the physical portion of the game, then he's not a complete receiver for Georgia. And eventually when you put him out there, you're not going to get the full benefit of his usage there because it's going to tip off what play is coming. You want receivers that don't necessarily indicate the play call that's coming. I thought that Jordan Rodgers, as much as sometimes we have our issues with Rodgers around here, thought he had an interesting tweet about Auburn about how much their play calling this season has been tipped off by the personnel they have on the field. You want to have complete players that can both block and run and catch so that the defense doesn't get as much of an indication of what Georgia's doing. Now, I believe that by the time the season's done, the light may come on for Robertson. But if it's not, I kind of understand why Kirby's not playing him, especially considering the fact that there are other wide receiver options right now. Talmadge Stovall says that Campbell's an 18-year-old freshman. Dude will be a stud next year. I completely agree with Talmadge on that. Plus, I mean, at a certain point in time as a program, you'd kind of like to be in a position where you don't need saving by freshmen quite as much as Georgia seems to have had over the last couple of years. I mean, I think one of the things you got to sort of notice here is how easy it was for this freshman to win that starting job there. So, I think that's an issue to point out here is that, yes, Tyson's gotten beaten a couple of times, but we also don't, always notice the 9,000 other times when he doesn't get beat. But the fact that he stepped in and earned that job as quickly as he did speaks to his talent, but also speaks to the need that existed there at the defensive back position. Dapper Dan says, I'm not opposed to seeing more Stokes and Webb. Not saying I don't like having Campbell out there, but I've been impressed so far watching those two when out there. Yeah, certainly in the case of Webb, I'd probably agree with you on that. I know that Eric Stokes has gotten some compliments from Kirby Smart from time to time, but I mean, before the season began, given what I thought I knew about those players and given what I thought I knew about Campbell, I sort of assumed Campbell would become the starter, and the fact that he did, I just think speaks to the fact that there is a pretty big talent disparity between these guys. Remember, Georgia wants to play that press man coverage. You really got to be able to run like Campbell to be able to do that. Of all the problems that Georgia has, I don't think that Tyson Campbell is among the most significant, even though he's been obviously beaten a couple of times. Ronald Watson says, man, please, with all that blocking mess. If he can score touchdowns, who cares? This is about Demetrius Robertson. Can Fromm get him the ball? Y'all make too many excuses. But, Ronald, I mean, I just gave you a counterexample about that a moment ago, about how a wide receiver being able to block is not something that coaches just talk about, to sound like coaches. I mean, I live in Atlanta. One of the best, wide receivers in the NFL is Julio Jones. Now, you can say, well, Julio Jones hasn't found the end zone enough. I get that. But, look at Julio coming out of Alabama, the physical way in which he played the game. It's not like the archetype for what Kirby Smart wants to see from his wide receivers doesn't exist. It existed at Alabama with Julio Jones, and a lot of the guys who've come after that fact have kind of followed in those footsteps. If you want to be a finesse-based, non-physical wide receiver, then the place that you should have stayed was the Pac-12 or somewhere west of the Mississippi. But Demetrius Robertson wanted to come into this league because he wanted to play at the highest level and get the attention needed to be a high NFL draft pick. But doing that means embracing the part of the game the way that it's embraced down here. I think eventually Demetrius Robertson's likely going to do that. But, I think as it stands right now, the Georgia coaches are just calling balls and strikes. Who's ready and who's not. For instance, if you told me more of D-Rob meant taking J.J. Holloman off the field right now, that's not a trade I think I want to make, because I see Holloman doing all the things that receivers are asked to do, not just part of the things. Now, yes, there is no one that challenges defenses vertically the way that Robertson potentially could. But you know what? I got to have more than just that. So not only do I believe that the light can come on for Robertson, I believe that it might eventually come on for Robertson. But if it doesn't, Georgia's better off using the receivers that it has in the rotation right now. Heath Duran on the subject of Brenton Cox. Cox is on the field a lot, and yes, he hasn't necessarily collected a lot of stats as of yet, but that's another guy that, much like Tyson Campbell, has got such a bright future. And having him out there now, I think, increases the likelihood that big-time stuff happens by the time November rolls around, and then ultimately he becomes a big part of the story late in the season. It's that talent infusion from the young guys that you could get by the time the season's over with. I think it's going to go a long way to determining just how good Georgia is. I think that's an important thing to remember. Random Dan on YouTube also brings up an interesting point. He says, why are y'all comparing us to Alabama? Who cares about them? We need to concentrate on us. I mean, I do think Random brings up a decent point that on the heels of a loss to LSU that potentially exposed some issues, I think that for now it's probably more appropriate to talk about what Georgia needs to do better as opposed to the ways in which it does compare to Alabama. And as I've admitted, I'm probably a little too guilty of doing that from time to time. But this is probably a moment in which a little less of that probably makes sense. Amos Williams says, J.J. Holloman can't create separation like D-Rob can. I don't deny that. I think you're probably right about that. But I've got to have a wide receiver that can do more than just create separation. Because remember, the same guy that might not want to block is also going to have a hard time getting off press man coverage. You don't see that in the Pac-12. You got receivers 15 yards off the ball here. But, you know, in the SEC, you got cornerbacks like Greedy Williams who want to get in under your chin and pop you as soon as the ball is snapped. So the physical part of this is about more than just blocking here. It's also about getting off of what's happening there at the line of scrimmage. Once again, I won't dispute the fact that I think Robertson will eventually do that. But right now, apparently the Georgia coaches think that he is not. Ryan Henderson says they can't separate if they are blocking. You know, I just think that the physical brand of football that Georgia used to, you know, run its way to a national championship game a year ago, national championship game appearance a year ago. I mean, Georgia's not going to abandon that formula just because it happens to have Demetrius Robertson on its roster right now. It's not going to completely throw all of that away. I mean, Georgia's going to be doing what it's doing 15 years after Demetrius Robertson's long been forgotten Athens. Now, when Robertson came to Georgia, there was, I don't think anybody in the media more excited about that than I was. And I still think that excitement may end up being justified. But you got to do more than just be able to run and catch. You just do. Trey Duke's critical of some of the people who've been critical of Robertson not being used. Listen, I get it. I mean, there are a lot of fan favorites on the Georgia roster who are not going to get as many touches and many, you know, as much attention as probably we'd like to see in the offense. But if you want to talk about who, among all the names that comes up here this week, if you want to talk about the name who ought to be getting the most touches of all, right now it's not Demetrius Robertson. Right now it's Elijah Holyfield. I mean, so if you want to start listing the priorities of who should get more involved in the offense and who should get more involved in a lot of this kind of stuff, it's really Holyfield right now who you're going to find more touches for, given what he did on Saturday. I mean, that's the difference between Georgia being back in that national championship conversation and not. Figuring out how you can, you know, get him 20 carries. Figuring out if DeAndre Swift's going to remain healthy enough to be that 1-2 punch with Elijah Holyfield. Those are your critical issues. I mean, Demetrius Robertson, to a certain extent, has always been a luxury item here. But your bread and butter, the thing that you got to be able to do is run the football again. So, you know, I'm a lot more willing to entertain the thoughts of you know, why there wasn't more for Elijah Holyfield than I am the thoughts for why there wasn't more of Demetrius Robertson. I completely agree with you that Georgia needs those wide receivers to create the separation. Robertson might eventually be one of those, but there's more to the game than just that. Matt Rukavina says we haven't really spent a lot of time with why we got away from the ground and pound, keep chopping style of play. Yeah, we probably haven't talked about that enough. I mean, we've talked about it certainly, I think, every day a little bit, but it remains one of the critical issues facing Georgia. And I think one of the most disappointing things about the day from the standpoint of a Georgia fan against LSU was it had the appearance of panicking. And I just think the Georgia coaches are better than that. I don't believe that they truly panicked during the game, but it certainly looked that way. I mean, let's not forget, until the very late stages of the game, Georgia was never down more than 16 points. And I've seen some people in the media say that the 16-point deficit dictated the fact that Georgia had to throw the ball more. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. 16 points is, if you want to consider two-point conversions, that's a two-score game. That's not the kind of deficit that ought to force you to abandon what had worked for you for the last 2 years, especially when the mantra of this team has been keep and chopping. Now, I think people like the phrase keep chopping more than they like the actual meaning of the phrase. I think once people find out what it means, I think some fans are actually a little disappointed. Keep chopping means that you keep doing it even when it's not working. And that's what Georgia had made its hallmark. Go back and look at two games almost get forgotten from the 2017 season. South Carolina and Missouri. In both those games last year at home, both those opponents, for the most part, really sold out stopping the run early in the game. And yet Georgia kept chopping. And eventually the games worked out to be easy victories. That's what keeping chopping is all about. Georgia didn't do that on Saturday. And, you know, it almost has the appearance that Dave Aranda, who is a very good LSU defensive coordinator, a guy that I likely think will be a head coach somewhere in college football next year, but it almost seems like Aranda won that coaching chess match between himself and Jim Chaney by showing a look that made Georgia decide it wasn't even worth trying to run with Elijah Holyfield. And I do think that's really disappointing. Now, I'm also hopeful and optimistic here that that's not going to happen for Georgia anymore, that Georgia against Florida won't abandon the running game that way. You can go back and look at 2016. Do you remember when Nick Chubb and Sony Michel went to, supposedly behind closed doors, the meeting with Jim Chaney and said, hey, we need to get the football here. We need to get that back. Get more carries. And obviously Jim Chaney responded by giving them exactly that. Maybe that's that kind of meeting that has to happen here in this situation as well. I don't know, but Georgia abandoning the run is a much more important issue to address right now than how many touches Demetrius Robertson may or may not be getting. And I say that as a guy that when Robertson came here, I probably wrote about him at DawgNation.com 2 or 3 times. But as it stands right now, that is not the consequential issue facing Georgia. It'd be a nice luxury to add into the mix here, but the must-have item right now is what's going on with the Georgia running game. All right. We are still going to get Barrett Sallee here. We're going to get more of your comments coming up as well. But I think what we need to do, if you don't mind, just kind of keep the train on the tracks here for a moment. We're going to go ahead and move on with the rest of our broadcast. I want to give you some thoughts about the other SEC games that are coming up this Saturday. I've got some more audio I want to play from you from Kirby Smart talking about Justin Fields here. So we'll do a lot of that kind of stuff, and then we'll get back with more of your comments and a little bit from Barrett Sallee here from CBS Sports coming up in a couple of minutes as well. So let's get ready to roll on with that. And, of course, it's great to have you with us here on DawgNation Daily.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
All right, let's get ready to move on here and do our SEC Through. It's, of course, when you think about SEC Through, a lot of times you think about my friends at MyBookie, especially on Thursdays. It's a chance to do our MyBookie Best Bets. Before we get to that, let me remind you that if you're looking to get your own best bets down, and let's face it, many of you have got better bets than I do. Well, if you're looking to get yours down, when you pick some winners, you want to get paid, right? You want that fast, no-hassle payout, and that can be true whether it's college football or another sport. Playoff baseball still going on. That's a fun thing for a lot of people to bet on. You don't have to just pick the winner. You can do the over-unders. You can do the parlays. There's fights you can bet on. I know a lot of you had some action down the McGregor match a couple of weeks ago, and I don't know if you had any kind of side action on this thing spilling into the crowd, but if you did, I guess that ticket probably cashed as well. Nonetheless, whatever you want to do, go play where the pros play at MyBookie. And right now, if you've never signed up before, you really got to do it now before the offer runs away. When you use the promo code DawgNation, you can get your first deposit matched dollar for dollar. But you got to go faster. You need to act on that right now. Dollar for dollar match when you use the promo code DawgNation. You simply find MyBookie online. That's MyBookie. Find them online. Use the promo code DawgNation. After that, you play, you win, and you get paid. But you can even get paid before you even make your first bet when you make that deposit by using the promo code DawgNation, because your first deposit can be matched dollar for dollar. So use the promo code DawgNation, all one word, spelled the way it's supposed to be, DAWG. When you find MyBookie online. All right, speaking of that, MyBookie Best Bets here, and at this point I'm probably kind of grasping at straws, but I actually do have a couple strong opinions on a few of these games. The first one, though, is not necessarily one of those. Auburn is at Ole Miss. Ole Miss is a 3.5-point home underdog after squeaking by Arkansas last week. You know the Auburn season is a disaster. Here is where I'm probably going to look like a fool on Monday. But I am not quite ready to give up completely on Auburn's season just yet. Malzahn may be coaching for his job. Still a better overall talent level. Ole Miss's defense is terrible. If Jarrett Stidham can't move the football against Ole Miss's defense, then he needs to pack it up. Now, Malzahn has said he's sticking with Stidham for the game on Saturday. Obviously, Ole Miss can put pressure on you by scoring points. I just feel like in a last stand situation, Auburn finds a way to win this one by more than the 3.5 points here, or wherever the spread might be when you find it at MyBookie. I just feel like Auburn's the play here, minus the 3.5. I guess I'll take him as a MyBookie best bet. I could not have been more wrong with the Tigers a week ago. I'm also going to go upset here in Arkansas with Tulsa coming to town. Philip Montgomery, the former Baylor offensive coordinator, is the Golden Hurricanes head coach here. Arkansas is terrible. I just continue to believe that. They've played some SEC teams close, but on the heels of just a gut punch loss to Ole Miss last week, do they pack it in here against Tulsa, who certainly needs the game a lot more than Arkansas probably does? Plus the Gus Malzahn watch could be on there in Arkansas for a little buyer's remorse from the Hogs fans who maybe would prefer Malzahn, who they almost got, to Chad Morris, who they did get. This could be a tricky situation there in the natural state. Let me take Tulsa plus the 7 here as a MyBookie best bet. I have typically not felt very strong one way or another about Alabama games this season. They're a huge favorite in every game. It's kind of hard to know, will they, cover by a point, which they did last week, or fail to cover by a point, which they did 2 weeks ago. This, though, may be the Alabama game that I feel the strongest about this season. I feel like Alabama minus the 28.5 at Tennessee is actually a really strong play on Saturday. It's a MyBookie best bet for me for a couple of reasons. First of all, Tua Tagovailoa status is in question. That doesn't scare me off this point spread as much as you might think. If Jalen Hurts plays significantly, which I believe he will, I think that Nick Saban will look to showcase some offense around Hurts as a reward for him sticking around. That's another reason to like Alabama here. I also think that Nick Saban has spent an offseason trying to combat what he views as negative recruiting. When Saban says negative recruiting, what I think he actually means is young coaches with more energy than him trying to sell a very similar kind of program and a very similar kind of product. I think he views Jeremy Pruitt as traitor, maybe too strong of a word, but certainly a potential threat to him. I think beating him by 40 or 50 points is a good way to kind of quiet some of that recruiting talk. Remember, Tennessee got J.J. Peterson for the 2018 class from Alabama as a for instance here for what Pruitt can do as a recruiter. I think that Saban's actually looking to beat Pruitt bad on Saturday. I will take Alabama minus the 28.5 and call that a MyBookie best bet. Then a couple other quick ones to mention here. LSU, we all saw last week how good they are, but this is a scary spot for the Tigers. Maybe not to lose the game, but maybe looking ahead to Alabama in 2 weeks, maybe still basking in the glory of storming the field after beating Georgia. Watch Mississippi State to keep this close. Plus the 7 or wherever you find it at MyBookie. That's a MyBookie best bet for me. I don't have a strong opinion on Vanderbilt and Kentucky. Vanderbilt's a hard team to evaluate one way or another. They're up, they're down, they're somewhere in the middle. Derek Mason, I think, is kind of a blowhard, to be honest with you. That's not a coach I have a great deal of respect for. But overall, this is probably a stay away for me. Obviously, as Kentucky looms for Georgia the Saturday after the cocktail party. We'll make that your SEC through. All right. And now, of course, here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, it seems like really every day this week we've had to have some kind of conversation with the quarterback situation. What did happen against LSU, what many fans hope to see happen against Florida. And, before I let you hear a little bit from Kirby Smart talking about Justin Fields and kind of updating his status or what Smart believes Fields' status is for the game next Saturday, I think it's important to remember. What you've seen publicly from the Fromm camp and from the Fields camp all season long continues to be commendable. I think both these, guys, we know that privately Fromm and Fields both want to play. We know that, right? But both these guys continue to behave with so much dignity and class here. They're not tweeting a bunch of stuff. They don't have parents spouting off a bunch of stuff. It's all been done in such a first-class manner by both of them. It's one of the reasons why I continue to believe that Georgia's lucky to have both these guys here. You want good guys at every position. Georgia's probably got 2 good quarterbacks. I think that's a good thing, and I hope the fan base around DawgNation continues to take the lead of both these quarterbacks who have just behaved in such a really commendable way here. But obviously on the field, the issue is the fact that no matter who plays quarterback for Georgia, the results need to be better than what they were last Saturday against LSU. It's undeniable that some Georgia fans think that Justin Fields is the guy that can bring Georgia that higher level of quarterback play. So will we see more of him next Saturday? Kirby Smart said that option's always available, and it's always on the table. Here's Smart from Tuesday on Fields.
Justin's growing. Justin's getting better each and every day. I think his maturity is getting better in the meeting room. He's picking things up. He's developing. He's certainly eager to get that opportunity, and he continues to progress and do things in practice. Then those opportunities may present themselves. We're never closing that door completely at all because we got to play the guy that gives us the best chance to win.
I don't think it should ultimately be a surprise here that Smart's tactic with the quarterback position is the same as virtually every other, tactic he's taken when he's spoken publicly about issues around his program, going back when he first took the job here in 2016. Smart is not going to be influenced by outside forces here. Fans that want to see more of one player at one position during our comment section earlier, folks were talking about Demetrius Robertson or a quarterback here or a running back there. Smart's just not going to be influenced on that, which is ultimately what you want from your coach on any other kind of issue. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, from time to time, I wish he would be a little bit more forthright with the quarterback situation. Give me more of an explanation of how the pecking order really is working out at practice and why, Field seems to play different amounts in certain games, whether, it's almost 0 against Missouri, slightly more against Tennessee, and kind of, even more than that in some of the lesser opponents Georgia's played. I wouldn't mind seeing a little more forthright conversation from Kirby Smart from time to time. But the Kirby Smart that got Georgia the playoff a year ago is the same version of himself who's also dealing with his quarterback situation right now. And I do take Kirby at his word here. The door is open for Fields to play more. And over the course of these 2 weeks, the week away from the watchful eye of the media, heading towards a bye week on Saturday, and then the intense week of practice getting ready for the cocktail party, I think Justin Fields is going to have a chance during those practices to step up and prove that he's worth more playing time this season. It's obviously going to be a fascinating storyline to watch out for. Let me also take a moment to step away from the football world and mention something else for a moment. One of the cool things that I get to do here on DawgNation Daily is hear from a lot of you. We talked yesterday about an avid DawgNation Daily listener and viewer, Matt Chastain, who's got a great new movie coming out this weekend. A small group. I was really proud to be able to tell his story yesterday. And when there are great things going on in our community, I like celebrating that. When there's also, something that is a little less happy, we also, from time to time, want to bring that up as well. Carlos Cardozo, who many of you recognize from our comment section as a longtime commenter to the program, he's actually been battling cancer here a little bit. And he reached out to me on Twitter yesterday to let me know why we haven't seen as much of him in our comment sections as of late. And I just told him that obviously our prayers around this program are very much with him. I know many of you feel the same way. Now, it sounds like Carlos, who's obviously a big-time fighter, he's going to fight this and win this battle, is well on his way back to a full recovery, which is great to see. He may even be in the cocktail party in a couple of weeks here. But that's a frequent commenter who we haven't seen as much from lately. It sounds like he's been battling an illness here, but it also sounds like he's on his way to winning that battle. So, Carlos, we say congratulations to you for that. Keep on going, and our prayers are certainly with you. All right, as we get ready to wrap up today's program, let's do so with a couple things here. First of all, Gator Hater Countdown. I actually forgot to put the number here on my sheet. What'll be 9 days away? Yeah, 9 days away from the Gator Hater Countdown. The great thing is when you get this close to it, all of a sudden it's a lot easier to keep up with exactly when that game's going to take place. This is also the time of year we have to start checking our math a little bit more to make sure we're actually counting down the right number of days. Last year, a DawgNation Daily listener or viewer checked in with us to let us know that somewhere around 100 or so days out that our countdown wasn't actually correct. So we had to fix it over the course of a weekend. So we'll check our math on this one once again. And I'm getting excited about the Florida game. For all the talk that's out there about Georgia right now, can't wait to see a lot of that kind of stuff cleaned up and corrected by the time you get to the Gators. Also, SEC basketball media days yesterday in Birmingham. Nice to see Tom Crean kind of center stage there. Excited about the basketball season. We'll see you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily. And on video. So let me communicate here for a moment. So how many more minutes do we have? Are we away for this? About 5-ish or so minutes. So here's what we're going to try to do. We're going to be in about 5 or so minutes. We'll get Barrett Sallee from CBS Sports and get that taken care of, which should be a lot of fun. In the meantime, I'm going to take some more of your comments here while we wait to do that. I know that Barrett will be worth the wait here in just a minute. And we'll kind of have a good time here with some more comments, which is what a lot of y'all really enjoy anyway. Brian Skelton says that Georgia's not in panic mode yet. I completely agree with Brian on that there are obvious reasons for concerns. And we started our regular broadcast a little earlier by one of the subjects that we mentioned was that need to get better at stopping the run. That's a concern. But it's not a opportunity to panic yet. Remember, Georgia is still going to be a sizable favorite in every game it plays the rest of the way. In a case like Auburn, they're even a bigger favorite now than they would have appeared to be a couple of weeks ago. In the case of Florida, Florida's ranked 11th in the AP poll. They beat LSU. To some Georgia fans, I think they loom as a giant. Maybe memories of what a thorn in the side of the dogs Florida's been in the past start to reemerge here. Georgia, according to what Caesar's Palace put out the other day, is still a 7.5-point favorite in that game. The ESPN Football Power Index data still gives Georgia about an 80% chance of winning the game. Or, I'm sorry, 70% chance of winning the game. So, listen, that's all important to remember here. Now, not a guarantee that Georgia will win against Florida, not even a guarantee they'll even, play better. But certainly people who are less probably prone to emotion than some of us within the bubble of DawgNation a little more pragmatic about all of this. They're still not turning their back on Georgia despite the fact that Georgia lost a game. We talked about that a good bit on the show yesterday. I think that's an important thing to remember once again. Tram Dickerson says if we don't beat ourselves, we can win every game this season. That's obviously something Georgia's looking to combat against. There's no doubt about that. Drew Eist says, do you think LSU and Georgia will win the SEC West and East for a rematch in the SEC Championship? I still think that's a pretty significant long shot. LSU is a huge underdog still to Alabama. That's important to remember. But it's certainly more of a possibility than I think we initially thought it was going to be. So that's a pretty interesting thing to think about. All right, we'll have some time for some more comments coming up in a moment. But fun guest right now, a guy that knows the SEC well. Let's get ready to welcome in Barrett Sallee here to DawgNation Daily. And, of course, you know him and love him from CBS Sports. You see him on Twitter at Barrett Sallee. He's a guy that's covered the SEC for a long time. And he's a great voice to have here on DawgNation Daily presented by Marco's Pizza. Barrett Sallee, welcome back to our program. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks for your time. How you doing?
I'm doing good, B.A. What's going on?
You know what? Trying to, calm some nerves here and some anxiety. Maybe some of that's even actually my own here on the heels of what happened with LSU on Saturday. So you've been around the block a few times. You know that's the way it kind of goes. Everything is great until a loss occurs, and after a loss takes place, all of a sudden we reevaluate all the things that we thought were good just a few days ago.
Yeah, all hell breaks loose. The program's dying. You might as well just fold up the shop and never play football again after one loss. Well, look, honestly, I know Georgia fans hate to hear that, but isn't that a compliment? Isn't that a big statement on the current status of Georgia football that one road loss at LSU sends everybody into freakout mode? If that's not a sort of subtle compliment
Sure.
to where Kirby Smart has the program, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a fair point. I think I know where you're coming from on that, and I think you're right about that. I also want to get your thoughts on this because, from time to time, I think it's important for us to hear some outside perspectives. Now, you live in the state of Georgia, but you're kind of outside the bubble of DawgNation. Obviously, the thing that has dominated the conversation here over the last few days is what did or didn't happen for Georgia quarterback on Saturday. Not a good game for Jake Fromm. Nobody will deny that. A lot of Georgia fans saying there ought to be more of Justin Fields. Should have been more in the game against LSU. Some fans hoping for a lot more of Fields against Florida. What do you make of the current quarterback situation in Georgia?
I think that what happened against LSU was more on Kirby Smart than it was Jake Fromm. Jake Fromm had his worst day. We all know that. We all saw it. It's impossible to deny that. But we know that there's more in the playbook for Justin Fields, and yet it didn't even seem like they considered trying to get there. And that's what I think the biggest problem is. I think, look, Jake and Justin both know what's going on. They understand they both have roles. They understand that they're going to fill those roles, and that at times that means one of them's got to sit on the bench. More likely than not, that's going to be Justin Fields most of the time. But in that situation, it was clear that Jake could not get the job done for whatever reason. It was just a bad game, whether he was LSU was doing something to him that he didn't expect. Whatever the reason, it was clear that Jake Fromm was a liability. So if you have that package, or multiple packages anyway, for Justin Fields, and you say that you trust him, well, then go trust him. Like, do it. Show it to us. So I think that's more on Kirby Smart, for not realizing that there's an option there, that there's an adjustment just waiting for him to make, and he didn't do it. So, look, moving forward, it's not freak-out mode for Jake Fromm. He's had one bad game in his career. He led him to a national championship game last year. So I don't think you need to freak out because of that game. I would be more...
Hear you saying is that you're more in favor, or maybe think the better solution for Georgia is more of Fields in a backup role, just where he has more freedom to do, some of the things that we think he's athletically gifted to do. Doesn't sound like you're calling for a switch at quarterback, which is what some Georgia fans have been calling for on the heels of not seeing as much of Fields as they would have liked.
Yeah, there's no reason to call for a switch right now. I mean, it's one bad game. I understand the frustration. It's one bad game. He's allowed to have a bad game. You don't want to hear it. You don't want to see it. You don't want that game to cost you anything. But, you need to figure out a way to prevent it from happening again. And that's the most important thing. That's why I think it's really important to get Justin Fields into situations where he's not a backup, where he's not, a role player. If he can take the reins of an offense when it's struggling, go let him do it. And he did it against Tennessee. That drive that essentially set up the touchdown to ice it, that was pretty much a Justin Fields drive. So you know that exists. So if you know that it exists, you can use that to your advantage. He doesn't have to be a backup. You can have a two-quarterback system that's workable, and I think Georgia wants to get there with Jake being the main guy. And I think Jake should be the main guy. But if you have this sort of built-in, rotation or built-in insurance policy within your offense that you built basically all offseason, well, use it when you're supposed to, and that didn't happen against LSU.
The most shocking thing for me, though, Barrett, about the game on Saturday was Georgia's decision to seemingly abandon the run. Now, Kirby Smart kind of explains it a little bit differently, but the numbers kind of speak for themselves. Elijah Holyfield, in particular, was having a pretty big day, but his carries end up being limited. Now, I'll never pretend that Holyfield is the running back that Chubb or Michelle was a year ago, but I think he's demonstrated that he ought to be getting more carries than he's getting, and the fact that Georgia didn't keep chopping, as its phrase has kind of been on Saturday, that for me was the most shocking thing of all.
Yeah, that was shocking. Now, you have to credit LSU because, they kept an extra guy in there and did, a lot to take that away. So that's not necessarily a Georgia thing, although certainly it played a part of it, but it wouldn't necessarily have been successful the way LSU was playing defensively. But, yeah, I think Holyfield has proven that he needs more of the offense. And look, DeAndre Swift's a great running back, but if you've got that many running backs, and Georgia's been really good at this, throughout the last decade, use them. You've got to use them. So, that helps everybody. That keeps everybody fresh. Backs, want to be 1A. They all do. All the quarterbacks want to be starters. Justin Fields wants to be 1A. But if you've got the ability to protect yourself and give your team options, use them if you're the coaching staff. And yeah, I agree. Holyfield's done a really good job. That game, that drive in the first half when they just ran right down the field, they couldn't do that anymore. Now, part of that's on LSU, part of that's on the coaching staff, but they did abandon the run, and it seems like they put Jake Fromm in a position where to get out of this funk, they wanted him to throw himself out of this funk, and that didn't seem wise considering what was going on with him.
All right, so let's fast forward here a little bit. If you want to go back before the season started, I want to say the South Point Sportsbook had Georgia as a 15-point favorite over Florida. Florida's turned out to be a little bit better. Caesars Palace this week has Georgia as just a 7.5-point favorite against the Gators. The win percentages are going down on some of the analytics sites there as well. Kentucky's also turned out to be better. Would you mind doing a little forecast here of how you think the rest of the season is going to go for Georgia? Does it get right back to its winning ways here and, kind of finishes off much the way that people expected it to? Or is there really something that bubbles up against LSU that now maybe makes you doubt what could have been an 11-1 season now being a 10-2 season, which for most Georgia fans would be a disaster?
Well, again, subtle compliment to Kirby Smart there. No, I don't think anything changes. Felipe Franks can't throw. And Florida's offense, even though they've played well and they've strung a few upsets and are in the top 15. It's not been because of the offense. It's been in spite of the offense, which is more or less Will Muschamp's deal at Florida, and more or less Jim McElwain's deal at Florida. So Georgia has no issues with that because even if they're shut down a little bit offensively by what defense at Florida, it's nowhere close to what LSU is right now. So I think Georgia will be fine. It was a bad day last weekend, and I think from a talent standpoint, they're significantly better than Florida. I think from a talent standpoint, they're light years ahead of where Kentucky is. And you look at Kentucky, they're good, but it's been sort of smoke and mirrors. Terry Wilson is one of the worst passers in the SEC right now. So they'll load up against Benny Snell, even though Georgia's rush defense hasn't been great. If you put 11 guys in the box, it can be great pretty easily. And dare Terry Wilson to beat them. And I don't think he can do that. I just think that the freak out over Georgia, I think, is like a little bit exaggerated at this point.
Before we let you go, Barrett, let me go off the subject of Georgia just for a moment. I am fascinated by what's been going on at Auburn. Obviously, most of my audience enjoys that from kind of a guilty pleasure standpoint. But, specifically this notion that there are reports out there that that Auburn would be potentially willing to make a move on Malzahn at the end of the season, not worried about the money it would owe him. I think that's somewhere in the neighborhood of almost $40 million by the time this year comes to an end on a buyout there. What do you make of how bad Auburn is? And would really Stephen Leath, the president there, have the guts to write that big of a check, essentially admitting he made one of the biggest blunders an SEC administrator's made in modern times, and move away from Malzahn at the end of the season? That is a brilliantly fascinating soap opera, although I'm sure it's just absolute misery for the Auburn fans.
Yeah, I mean, I think they will, because you look, and I actually wrote a story about this for CBSSports.com. It's going up on Thursday. They made $61 million in profit last year. Not revenue, profit. So, yeah, it's a big check, but they're the 8th most valuable program in college football. So I would imagine that check, and look, buyouts are more guidelines than rules. Yeah, it's 38, whatever it is right now. That gets talked down. That gets negotiated down. So it's a big check, but it's a short-term problem because the money will still come back. So I don't think the finances have anything to do with it. To me, it's more about where the offense is going and where Gus is heading, because they can't run the ball. The offensive line is terrible. He's been the reason that the offensive line is terrible, because the recruiting has lacked in the last 3 years, and he's stubborn. I had a good conversation with a couple of people who I won't name that made this point to me. I think it's really, really smart. Gus Malzahn has been a head coach basically his entire coaching career. He's never had to be an underling. He's, with the exception of a few years as the offensive coordinator at Tulsa and Auburn, and 1 year at Arkansas. So if you have never been in a situation where you have to learn from legends or learn from good coaches, you don't really know how to manage a program. You don't really know how to delegate responsibility. Jeremy Pruitt came up under Saban. Urban Meyer came up and did his thing.
Yeah.
All these guys that are elite head coaches, Dabo Swinney, the same thing. They put in their time and learn. And Gus has really never had to do that. At Arkansas, he was given leeway under Houston Nutt, and they didn't get along at all, and Gus was only there for a year. At Tulsa, he had a little bit of time, and obviously at Auburn as well, but he hasn't really had a ton of that. So I think that's the problem. I think he needs to show less stubbornness. He did that last November, and obviously Jarrett Stidham was a big reason why. But Jarrett's regressed. Gus is now stubborn, and unless that changes, I think they will cut that check, because that's pretty much been Gus's MO for his entire coaching career, even when they went to the national championship game.
Yeah, I think a really interesting point, Barrett, and I look forward to reading your piece at CBSSports.com about that. Speaking of that, as we let you go here, remind folks how we can find more of you. Obviously on Twitter at Barrett Sallee. You're on the radio all the time. CBS Sports, we see your work there. But where else can we find more of Mr. Sallee here?
Yeah, follow me on Twitter. Download the CBS Sports app. Check us out on the web, CBSSports.com, and the streaming channel, CBS Sports HQ, has been a huge success. It's integrated into our smartphone app, our tablet app, our smart TV app. So if you have a Roku, Fire Stick, Apple TV, all that stuff, CBS Sports HQ is integrated into the app. It's 24/7, 365 sports news and highlights without the yelling, without the politics, without all that stuff. It's basically what ESPN News was when ESPN News first was created. So I'll be on that. I have been on that quite a bit throughout the course of the college football season, and will be in the future.
Sounds great, Barrett. It's always fun to have you in the program. You got great insight on the SEC. We'll look forward to speaking to you soon, all right?
All right. Thanks, B.A. My pleasure.
Good stuff there from Barrett Sallee. And I think his point about Gus Malzahn is kind of interesting, that Auburn's obviously got the money. It generates a lot of revenue. This is a program that's not been afraid to spend money before. They build these gigantic, scoreboards, for instance, video boards, that they're always looking to have some things to spend some money on. So we certainly get all of that. We certainly get all of that, they obviously are looking to spend that money and do all that kind of stuff. But if you're Stephen Leath, the Auburn president, the administrator here, the thing that you've got to be really careful of, though, is that while you have the money, it's not a very good line to have on your resume that you wasted the money. It's one thing to spend it towards something that adds value to the program. It's another thing to have to spend that money to erase a mistake that you made here. So ultimately, Auburn may be forced to make this move here. Barrett Sallee may be right about that. Some of the other people who've suggested that may be right too. But that's not the kind of decision that's not going to have some nasty side effects there for Auburn, which could make this a very fun offseason for the Georgia fans who like watching Auburn have to wallow in its misery. And then one more real quick point here. I'm glad to hear Barrett bring up a point that I've brought up a lot here, which is that even with a better record than we would have expected, Florida is still not a great offensive team. Remember, the blowout win against Tennessee came virtually on the heels mostly of short fields to work on. A lot of Tennessee turnovers helped that day. The high point total, I think, is a real misnomer there for what the Florida offense did in Knoxville. Yes, they won at Mississippi State, which is a good win. But there weren't a lot of points necessarily, a lot of offensive production that led to that. You don't have anything to argue about when you beat LSU. That's a huge win for the Florida program. And yet, even in that game, the overall numbers for Felipe Franks don't look great. I'll give Florida credit for being a more physical team than I expected. But the way that Georgia wins this game on Saturday, next Saturday, is by taking advantage of the fact that Florida is still a program that's struggling on offense. One of the reasons why I'm still confident there, even though the point spread shrunk to a certain extent, the percentage chance of winning seems to be going down. This is still a game in which I feel like Georgia's going to step up and play better than it's played. I think a lot of folks in Jacksonville will enjoy that. We've got plenty more DawgNation Daily coming up right now. All right, so for those of you on video, if you ever wonder how the sausage gets made around here, so occasionally we have an issue like that where we have to kind of go out of order, and the crack staff on the other side of the glass, and I always say that, over here to my left is a big glass wall. We've got a bunch of people helping us out and getting DawgNation Daily here on the air. So they will take the various segments and now build them back together in the order that you've come to expect here. So if you listen to the podcast later on, all of this will be happening in a slightly different order. The jigsaw puzzle that is this video program will be slightly different there, radio audience there as well. So if you only watch the show on video on a day like this, it might actually be interesting to check out the podcast, and we'll post it for you here at the world-famous DawgNation.com in a couple of minutes. It's kind of always kind of interesting to see kind of how we put this thing back together. Just to kind of, my big thing is I want DawgNation Daily to mostly sound the same every day. Now, some of you say, well, I wish it would be better. We're working on that, but at the very least, we want to repeat today what we did yesterday, just so that you don't get too confused by anything. So we'll kind of put all this back together and check that out. I'm also kind of deep into overtime here, but it doesn't feel right to go off the air without taking a few more comments. Do we have time to take a few more? Do y'all mind if we take a few more here? It sounds like they're okay with that. We'll take a few here. You can react to what Barrett had to say. My guess is that some of you will have strong opinions on that and kind of everything else from a busy edition of our program, which was promised here. Enrique Murillo saying he's having to knock out some work. People keep coming in and out of the office. Yeah, Enrique, we get that. I've always thought that maybe like the next iteration of DawgNation Daily, we should come up with a way to watch the show so it kind of looks like an Excel spreadsheet. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know how we'd quite make that happen, but maybe we need to come up with like an interface that makes it look like look a little bit more like actual work. That might be a pretty good idea on that. So Enrique, you do what you got to do, and we'll let you take care of all of that. Kelly Burnett says, I give LSU credit. They came to play, so will Florida. Yeah, Kelly, please don't misunderstand me on this. It's not my intention not to give Florida any credit. But the same way that, look, what this kind of reminds me of is the subject of bias, right? Bias pops up from time to time. And I think for some people, the notion of a bias gets misunderstood. The people who watch the show every day might be confused for being too biased in favor of Georgia. I got the red and black on again today. A lot of people that know of this show, would say, well, BA is going to be too biased in favor of Georgia. But bias is a door that kind of swings both ways sometimes. When Georgia does something well, we're probably all a little too guilty of being too happy about all of that. Our emotions, kind of get the best of us at times. But I think we also have a tendency to also overstate Georgia's weaknesses as well, especially in comparison to teams it's about to play. I think there's a nature of the emotional connection to the cocktail party that wants to say, well, if Georgia doesn't play better, it's going to get absolutely walloped by Florida. But there is the positive, the negative, and the reality for Georgia, and the positive, negative, and reality for Florida. And the reality is, the most realistic assessment is that the place that you get Florida is through its offense. That you do confuse Felipe Franks. You do, try to drop back into passing lanes for him more. Maybe that's not a day where you're looking to dial up a whole lot of blitzes because, Franks just can't complete passes into tight windows. So if you create those tight windows, you make the day hard for him. Now, there's always going to be, some rando Florida fan who pops in here and says, BA, you're overestimating UGA. No, I'm not. I mean, Georgia could lose against Florida. If these two teams played 10 times, Florida would win a couple of those. I don't deny that. The game's is definitely going to be a little closer than I initially thought it would be. But the reason why Florida is, I think, ultimately destined to lose is because, as Barrett said, I think Barrett was spot on about this. Florida's still not great on offense, and it's where Dan Mullen's reputation as some sort of offensive guru is just total fiction. I mean, it's a complete creation on the part of the media. First of all, I don't know if you've noticed, but Dak Prescott's not exactly lighting the world on fire in the NFL anymore. Nick Fitzgerald's had his share of struggles at Mississippi State. He's a running quarterback, still not a passing quarterback. Dan Mullen's reputation as a quarterback whisperer, a quarterback guru, would seem to be without a abundance of evidence at the moment. Kelly Burnett says that I misunderstood him. I apologize. I'm not critical of you. I just sometimes I like to take the comments and just kind of run with them as quickly as I can. One of the tough things is, and I try to keep track of the comment section as well as I can, but sometimes when y'all kind of get going back with each other, which I love the back and forth with each other. Sometimes when I come in on the middle of that conversation, I may not 100% get all the context for that, including K9 Blues here responding back to another commenter says, we have a really good quarterback from who's battle-tested. No need to throw Fields into the fire. Same reason all of our freshmen aren't starting because of all of their potential. So here is my thought on Fromm and Fields. And I've, intimated this a lot throughout the week, but I want to make sure people know that had I been coach at Georgia or offensive coordinator at Georgia, I would have given Fields a chance to throw against LSU on Saturday. I think that he has played enough to be worthy of that moment, right? It'd be one thing if he never played at all, but he's been playing some. This notion that it would be just the biggest disaster ever if Fields threw a pass, I don't buy into that. Now, with that said, I want Fromm to start against Florida. I do. And I believe that there's a very good chance that Fromm will play better if he gets that opportunity. I do. And yet, if it's more of the same of what you got against LSU, at that point in time, I think that I would be looking a lot more seriously at making some kind of change to try to salvage that game, to try to salvage a chance at a championship this season. I would. Now, that's not going to satisfy maybe anybody in the audience. There's a portion of the audience that wants all Fields all the time. There's a portion of the audience that I think probably wants all Fromm all the time, or at least a majority of Fromm most of the time. And my answer kind of, unfortunately, probably splits the difference a little too much there. But I saw what Fromm was capable of doing last year, and he wasn't the only person in the Georgia offense. Yes, there was Chubb and Michelle, and there was Javon Wims, and there was all of that. But Fromm did a lot for Georgia. And I'm not throwing all that away just on the heels of one bad game. But if it continues in the first half against Florida, then yes, I'd probably be looking for some Fields in the second half there. More, and I mean as more than just a running quarterback and more than just a guy coming in for a change of pace, spot duty. I'd be looking to give Fields a chance to win that job on the field. But Kirby Smart's not going to do that without getting Fields' full attention here for these 2 weeks of practice. It's all about practice for Kirby Smart. It is. And, maybe he's going to too much great pains, too much lengths to orchestrate a quarterback competition, but that's Kirby's process here. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Let me go over here to YouTube for a moment, or for Facebook for a moment. Glenn Rubin says Fields has the ability to extend plays till receivers come open and also tuck it and run if need be. Would loosen up the defense. Yeah, that is something that I agree with. That on Saturday, part of the issue was we had really a couple of issues. I mean, the one thing that everyone will acknowledge, that Jake Fromm missed McCole Hardman. He overthrew McCole Hardman on that first drive, and that's a throw that Fromm's got to make. Fromm also didn't notice Terry Godwin wide open. Everyone, including Fromm himself, would acknowledge that's a mistake you've got to make. Those are 2 touchdowns that Georgia could have had. 2 touchdowns obviously changed the tenor of that game dramatically. But apart from those 2 plays, the other issue was, is that we got into a scenario where LSU, good secondary, is locking down Georgia's defensive backs, and Fromm didn't have a lot of obvious options to throw to beyond that. He had 2 moments in which he missed them. They could have both been touchdowns. No one's going to sugarcoat that. But in other portions of the game, Georgia just didn't have a lot to do offensively. Seemingly, LSU was, I guess, just strategically taking away the run, and Georgia allowed them to do that, and then taking away the long, deep throw there as well. That is a point where I think a running quarterback could have helped. He could have either taken an LSU defender away from his current duty and put him in as a spy on Fields, or he could keep a play alive long enough that the coverage would break down. The commenter that mentioned that, I think, is exactly right. Tyler Weeks, on a different subject in our Facebook comment section, also mentioned the notion of the Georgia offensive and defensive lines, what our opinion is of them thus far this season. I think the offensive line has been good, not great. And I mentioned this off the top of the program, that if you want to really kind of get into Georgia's talent level, the fact that Andrew Thomas, who's showing up as a midseason All-American on some of these national websites, the fact that he missed some time for Georgia, the fact that Ben Cleveland, who is a former 5-star and a rock-solid starter with an NFL future, the fact that he's in the midst of missing a good bit of time, the way that the Georgia offensive line has done without Cleveland here for a long stretch, Thomas for a brief stretch, that is something that it could not have done a year ago. Now, thus far, the Georgia offensive line may not be quite as good as last season's was, at least yet, but it's withstanding injuries in a way that Georgia's offensive line a year ago would not have been able to do. The defensive line, it's just got to get better. And I mean this all front seven. It's hard to separate the defensive line from the linebackers here in this. The front seven for Georgia's got to get better. I've been saying this for a while, and this is not just, hopefully it's more than just wishful thinking. If Jordan Davis can ever fully get that light to come on, he is what Georgia's missing. I don't know if he's good enough yet. I don't know if he's ready enough yet, but he's big enough. We know that. I mean, Davis as that big, just space-eating nose guard with, if he's on the field, it just opens up so many more opportunities for Tyler Clark and, Jonathan Ledbetter, and then whatever you've got going on at linebacker beyond that. I'm going to be a broken record on this, but I'm not going to waver on this. Georgia getting to where it needs to be is going to almost solely be dictated of an infusion of new personnel, an infusion of new talent. For Georgia this year, that means young players maturing over the course of the season and emerging as more talented versions of the guys who occupied those spots in September. That's how, if Georgia is in that playoff conversation again come December, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be a Jordan Davis. It's going to be a Channing Tindall. It's going to be maybe a Jamari Sallee or a Trey Hill. I mean, we have been saying this now for days and days and days, but the reason why we keep repeating it is because of how true I believe that it is. Kibo Weir says he got blocked by Greg McGarity on Twitter. Some of y'all. Sorry to hear that, Kibo. Daniel Taylor and Terry Locklear says, we started the LSU game running the ball. Then we invited Fromm to dinner, and he passed. Listen, I'll be the first to tell you that, the way in which Georgia seemingly abandoned the run was just a disappointing thing to see. Ronald Watson says, BA, please go over Fromm's stats against good defenses from last season to now. They ain't good. There's no doubt that Fromm had a bad game last year at Auburn. There's no doubt that he had a bad game this past Saturday at LSU. There's no doubt about that. I don't think that Fromm is necessarily all that indistinguishable from other quarterbacks who are going to have a tougher time against better defenses. The difference between Fromm and a lot of national quarterbacks is most national quarterbacks never see those kinds of defenses. In the SEC, you're going to see the LSUs and the 2017 Auburns of the world. You're going to see those defenses more. And in a game like that, which next Saturday will partially be once again, it's the kind of game where Fromm's going to play better. Now, if I'm going to acknowledge that if he doesn't play better, it's time for Justin Fields, I also need some of y'all to acknowledge that if Fromm does play better against Florida on Saturday, y'all got to give him some credit. Can we agree on that? That whatever you wanted to see happen on Saturday against LSU, can we all agree that Saturday is 2 Saturdays from now is a proving ground one way or another? That if Fromm doesn't improve, then it's more than time to see more of Justin Fields. But if Fromm goes out and has a big day, if you're truly a Georgia fan, you got to come in here and now you got to give Fromm the credit he deserves. Mike D says, you running late today, BA. Yeah, we run a little bit late today. I'm trying to give some more comments. We're going to get off the air here in a second, though. Ben Gunnell says that Kentucky's the biggest game left, really. We have to beat Florida. It's Kentucky that can steal the East. I kind of agree with Ben on this from the standpoint that I worry about the energy that Georgia's expending right now. And, you know, there's going to be more of that for Florida, maybe a little less of that for Kentucky. Hopefully the status – I mean, what I hope is that Kentucky wins against Vanderbilt on Saturday. And I don't know if Kentucky plays the week before Georgia or not. I should know that. I just don't know that. I may can pull that up while I'm talking here. But, you know, you do worry about the game against Kentucky coming after a big game for Georgia against Florida. That makes the game a little more dangerous. The other thing about the Kentucky deal is it's going to be cold. I mean, how many cold weather games has Georgia ever played? I mean, other than like Isaiah Wilson, how many players in Georgia's roster have ever played in a cold weather game? I know that sounds dumb, but and by the way, Kentucky's at Missouri the week before it plays Georgia, so do with that what you will. But in Lexington in November, it could be pretty chilly. That could be an interesting thing for that game there. But I'm definitely not in any way looking over that Kentucky game. I think it's a tough game for Georgia. Some of y'all have some funny comments. Colby Curry says, give me a shout out. I'm in Northwest Georgia sneaking at work to hear you go Dogs. Colby, we appreciate that. Thanks so much. Thanks for checking us out. Phil Rogers says, Georgia better be ready for both teams. Yeah, listen, I mean, I read that Dan Wolken quote off the top of the show today. And while I may disagree with some of what he says there is a reality check that the LSU loss provides that we have to acknowledge. That Georgia can't be strutting into Jacksonville. Georgia can't be strutting into Lexington. It can't be doing any of that kind of stuff. It's got to take all these games really seriously. Plus, you know, I know this is probably just a little too much Larry Munson, Vince Dooley style poor mouthing. The truth is, I'm not ready to write off Auburn as an easy game yet. I mean, let's see if Auburn lays down and dies against Ole Miss on Saturday. I think there's a chance that doesn't happen, and that game gets a little tougher here. So yeah, I mean, Georgia doesn't have a right now to be overlooking anybody. It's got to take care of its business and reestablish its credentials as a national power here. I don't deny that. Matt Rukavina says, I grew up in Lexington, about a mile or two from the Kentucky campus. It's chilly but not cold. Fair enough. Cold is below 32. It'll be 50s or so. The problem is if you've never had anything below 70s, all of a sudden 50s can feel a little bit cold. But I understand where you're coming from. All right, we got to get ready to go. Really appreciate all the comments here today. Really fun. Really good stuff. All right, we got a big day tomorrow. We'll have Jeff Sintel back on the phone again. We will get ready to enjoy what I hope is a fun bye-week weekend for all you guys and gals. I'm obviously looking forward to a little Saturday off, no doubt about that. But we got plenty more business to take care of before we get there. So if you missed a portion of our regular broadcast, or if you want to hear how it sounds when we put all the pieces back together, check out the podcast. It'll be up and running for you here. We'll also be on the radio this afternoon at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Rev. We'll have DN90 coming up in a couple of minutes here too. So no slowdown in content production from us, even though the Dogs are off on Saturday. Y'all have a great day. We'll look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for another episode of DawgNation Daily Live presented by Marco's Pizza. Have a good day, everybody.